am your host, DVC. Welcome to the Heartfelt Clubhouse. We are joined here today with Maya. Ooh. Tell us a little bit about yourself, Maya.
Hi there, I'm Maya. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I'm a Panamanian queer fine artist and tattoo artist based in Denver, and I'm super excited to be here.
Yes, and you have amazing puppies with us. We have Kiki and we have Lilo, which is awesome. So we kind of came together because we have a mutual friend, and then also you're an amazing artist, and we'd love to have you do some designs for the Heartfelt Club, right?
Which I am super stoked to do. I'm super passionate about that.
Yes, so what kind of stuck out to you about the Heartfelt Club?
Mostly just the mission and vision, like just, spreading awareness, but also using art to do so, which is such a healing, it's just such a healing thing, for most people that do it, I feel, for me at least, it heals so many of my wounds. And so like being able to do that with that end goal and that mission is like so amazing to me.
Yes. Well, that's awesome. I'm really happy that you feel that way, and I definitely have spoken to a few people who agree that, art is cathartic. Like it feels so good to kind of release into that. So when did you get started with your artwork?
I've been making art since I can remember.
Yeah.
Illustration has like always been super big for me, and I think it's definitely that whole kind of cheesy thing about artists where like you would die if you didn't. Like it's just so natural at this point. So yeah, just always.
And has it always kind of been a coping mechanism or a release?
I think yes. I don't think I realized that until the past few years, but absolutely. I mean, I think it was my way of processing what I was experiencing, and you don't really realize how essential that is until you have traumatic events in your life,
Yeah, for sure. With that being said, I know, we all come from all walks of life. I'm sure we've kind of have our own stories. Is there anything in particular, with regard to Heartfelt, that you would like to share about your story and how you kind of got into mental health?
Absolutely. So I was always passionate about, the importance of mental health and equating that to the importance of physical health. I think, addressing depression as something that's the same as a broken bone is really important. But obviously it became way more important to me when my dad killed himself when I was 18. And so that experience, changed my whole life. It still has touched my whole life, every single day. But I think, that experience just made it way more personal for me and, gave me a lot of space to think about, what suicide prevention means to me, what I want to advocate for in terms of that, and just, perspectives in those conversations came up for me,
Yeah, of course. Well, thank you for sharing that with us. I'm so sorry, my condolences. Tell us a little bit about your dad, if you're comfortable with that.
I would love that. Can I grab?
Yes.
I love sharing about my dad. He was so awesome. This is Christopher.
Oh, Christopher. Lovely.
And he actually adopted me, which is kind of even more special because he was my dad by choice.
Oh.
And he was so awesome. He was really funny and really sweet and really loving and just gentle. I feel like he was the definition of the opposite of toxic masculinity because he was so comfortable in himself and just, I like to think of him as a swan.
Oh,
I guess
I love
swans,
it.
just the way they move and how gentle they move through life,
Wow.
So, he was also a woodworker, so he just created beautiful things with his hands, which is really meaningful to me because I do the same thing and I try to do that every day.
Yeah, it sounds like you guys have an amazing relationship.
Yeah, it's really special to carry that, and I like to think that I like to have this perspective of gratitude where I'm really grateful that I had him for the time that I did and that I had that connection.
Yeah. And when that occurred, obviously it's jarring when something like that happens, but also you were at a fairly young age.
Yeah.
What did coping and, how did your mental health look during that time?
My mental health was definitely the worst it's ever been. And, coping really, maladaptive coping mechanisms, I had a huge spike.
Yeah.
Things that I had never reached for before I reached for. I had a pill problem at one point. I had like super severe panic attacks, which is where that started. And also I had an eating disorder already that I had had my entire life, but it got so much worse. And so like everything kind of got exacerbated, and I felt like I was just like reaching into the dark for any sort of relief at that point. Yeah, but that changed, you know, little by little I like started to realize like what I really needed and what was going to provide me like more sustainable relief, and that's like the opposite of maladaptive coping mechanisms. And the biggest part of that is, I think, structure and reaching out for help and like generating community. I think community and structure were like the two big holy grails for me that, you know, not only got me to a point where I could like be okay with being alive, but also those things sustain that desire to live for me now.
Yeah. Wow. So what kind of communities did you find during this time?
Yeah, so a huge resource for me was Judy's House, which is a children and young adults grief home in Denver. So I received like individual counseling, but I also had a support group there. So talking to other people who had experienced loss, some of them who had experienced loss by suicide too, who are also young adults, was super helpful and super validating, because, you know, people will have opinions about what you went through, and it's really helpful to be around people who experience it, because A, they know you don't want to hear their opinions about it, and B, they do understand, but they're not gonna put you in a box because they know how that feels.
Yeah.
So that was one community, and then the art making community here in Denver has really helped me a lot, like just having spaces where people invited me to collaborate. Like the Zine Fest is a huge example. The zine making community here is super collaborative and super accessible, because you're just designing something, printing it out and stapling it, and then trading zines with other people, selling to people. It really connects you to your community. And then my family was another huge one, you know, having a really tight-knit Latino family that supported me and loved me and knew how I was feeling and really took it seriously, you know, like they took it seriously and never made me feel like it was not relevant that I was depressed, or that it was like not as important as a physical injury.
Yeah, I definitely think that when it comes to these kind of traumatic experiences and loss in general, it's so sad because people will have opinions about how you should grieve, how you should move through it.
Or even about the person's death, especially with like something as taboo as suicide. Like people do have opinions about it. Literally, my dad's neighbor said like something really inappropriate about how God doesn't forgive people who commit suicide as we were cleaning out his house.
Wow.
So like, yeah, so going into spaces where people, and that's like, you know, my best advice to people supporting grieving people is like, don't impose your opinions on them or your expectations. Like, create space and hold space for them.
Yeah, no, that's an amazing point. And I definitely have even heard, like, you know, obviously I discuss mental health all the time, and I've had people tell me, like, okay, well, suicide is a choice. And as much as that's true, it's also, you know, a day in, day out fight. Like, it is a battle. It is a true disease, you know, when you're fighting.
And I think it's a lot more nuanced than that.
Yes.
Than saying that it is a choice or saying that it's selfish. Like, I find those things a lot very frustrating, because I think they boil something really complicated down to something very simple.
Yes, yeah. And like you said, just so they can put it in a box to try and understand it when...
Yeah. And also to try and like isolate themselves from it, because when you admit that something's like really confusing, it leaves you with all these questions and all this like kind of discomfort, and people want to run away from that with grief and with suicide.
Yeah, no, that's an amazing point. That's a really amazing point. And I definitely, obviously, you know, we advocate for men in this area because, you know, with these kind of stigmas around it, it can be really hard to admit that you do need that help.
Absolutely. And I think that there are definitely connections between the way depression impacts people and gender roles. You know, like men, there is a lot more pressure to succeed in different ways, and I think that really can be soul crushing sometimes. And the thing about that is, like, we all experienced we all experience soul-crushing emotions, but because women are, or like femmes are labeled as emotional already, it's almost like we have that space to be emotional, versus like men are labeled as not emotional, so when they come out and express emotion, it's like so much more of a risk.
Yes. Oh, completely. And you know, it's funny, we were talking about tattoos earlier. One of my next tattoos I'm going to get is Lift As You Climb.
Nice.
Just because I feel like, you know, as you were discussing, I'm very much allowed to show emotions. It's very accepted. I could cry in a restaurant and people wouldn't necessarily think less of me.
Yeah.
And so I have that door that I can open for men and for anyone who's struggling to express their emotions, you know, to allow them that safe space. So I think that's really awesome. Like, what you're doing with your art, what you're doing with speaking out in all the projects you have.
And likewise.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So as we know, October kind of houses a lot of different things. It is Bullying Prevention Month, Domestic Violence Awareness Month, National Depression and Mental Health Screening Month, and also ADHD Awareness Month. So with that being said, I just wanted to touch base on the importance of actually, you know, getting mental health screening. And it's something that can be done, facilitated at home to begin. You can hop online, take a nice quiz, kind of feel where you're at, and then you'll take that screening quiz, schedule an appointment with your primary physician at the time, and then if need be, you'll seek that assessment from actual centers of help, which I've done this before. You know, when I was going through a lot in college, whatever traumas may have occurred, and I was like, something is up, like I cannot gauge where I'm at, and I actually did use this 3-step process to kind of figure out, okay, yes, I need to integrate into therapy because I can't do this alone, and I shouldn't have to.
And there have been moments where I was there too, and even the part of setting up therapy I couldn't do alone.
Yes.
And so like being able to ask a parent or a friend, like, hey, can you make that phone call for me? Or can you help me find someone that takes my insurance is okay.
Yeah, that's definitely huge. And it's like, it's such an interesting process because it can be difficult to kind of, you know, get started and navigate through. And then, like you said, once you get into it, there is that community. You know, we do our Man of the Month, we help people get into therapy, and our most recent Man of the Month, Grant, he actually is like best friends with his therapist. He's like, this is my guy. Like, I can't wait to like continue this relationship. So it's a really safe space to really build and get to know someone who cares about you and allows you that space to kind of flood them with whatever you have going on.
Yeah, it's literally their job.
Yeah.
And like usually when you make that first point of connection, even just with like a primary care doctor that's not a mental health person, usually they have resources and next steps for you. Like knowing that I feel like it helps a lot to know that taking that first step will lead you and reveal the rest of your path and like what you need to do to get help.
Yes, completely. So I do have a question that by all means you're never obligated to answer. What does depression kind of look like for you?
That's a great question. So you mentioned ADHD, and actually I want to talk about like how that combines with depression for me. Awesome. Because I have ADHD diagnosed, and not that you need a diagnosis for it to be valid.
Yes.
But I have ADHD, and having a neurodivergent brain definitely affects how depression works for me because the symptoms of me being neurodivergent become more intense when I'm depressed. So like inability to do tasks that don't give me like an immediate reward. Like this is pretty common information, but like people with ADHD struggle to do tasks that are like considered unpleasant, and they actually chemically don't get as many good feelings from doing those unpleasant tasks as like a person without ADHD. That becomes even more intense when I'm depressed because depression does that also.
Yeah.
You know, like it makes it like less easy to do unpleasant tasks, and so like not only that, but then ADHD and depression cause me to be way more focused on pleasant tasks. So like if I'm only wanting to do tattoos, you know, it like, or like paint, or which is like, that's like low level depression for me because when I get onto high level depression I can't do those things. But my like hyperfocus ADHD causes me to really go into an imbalance where I like can't do the things that I really need to do, and I can only do things that are like rewarding in a very specific way, if that makes sense. So, and that gets more and more intense, right? So like, you know, there are fewer and fewer tasks I can do the more depressed I get, and that goes with ADHD as well. Like if my symptoms are really intense, there are fewer and fewer things that I feel like my brain can do, and I do those things really well because of that hyperfocus symptom, but it's just an imbalance. And like that's what depression looks like for me. It's like not being able to create structure for myself, and that's a cycle because I need the structure to not be depressed, and then I'm depressed so I don't create those structured systems for myself. You know, I stop using my planner, I stop taking my meds, I like stop those routines that really, you know, help me stay out of that. And so it's like a really slippery slope because you neglect those routines for a couple days and it becomes like a big cyclical thing. But it looks that way, and it also looks like the desire to isolate and the feeling of being alone, even when you're around other people, like this irrational feeling that like I'm rational and irrational because like to an extent we are alone in our thoughts and stuff like that, but it's so easy to forget, you know, the like profound nature of the people around you and how much they love you and how connected you are to them. Like you just feel like an alien.
Yeah. Wow. No,
that was a really long answer.
No, that was amazing, and it's so interesting because like we have very different views of depression or feelings, experiences with our depression, and yet still some commonalities.
Yeah.
You know, like you're speaking on it, and I'm like, I fully understand that.
Yeah.
That's how I feel as well, and I think it's also important to like know that when you're going down that slippery slope, do you have a kind of way to pull yourself out, or is this kind of where you would potentially reach for someone's hand to get some help?
Yeah, I think it's super important to know like when you need help, and that's different for everyone, but I think it's super important to know like when you're about to, first of all, asking yourself, am I safe all the time? And getting really into that habit of asking yourself and also having those conversations with your friends and your family where like it's a normal question to ask when you say I'm depressed, like are you safe? And having those like kind of measurements of where you're at so that there's like very strict boundaries, like okay, I don't feel like I'm safe, what's the game plan?
Yeah.
So that's super important, is like having game plans, but also just knowing your limitations, like okay, when I don't take my meds 3 days in a row, I can't handle this on my own anymore.
Yeah.
So, you know, I don't have like super rigid systems in place for that, but I think I'm pretty good at realizing when I need help and asking for it, and I think reminding myself that I'm not a burden is getting easier and easier as time goes on.
Yeah, it's definitely like an ongoing process, you know, it's never going to be perfect, and it's definitely something to like work on daily. I do the same thing, and it's definitely a lot of my friends nowadays. It's just, like you said, it's like, okay, we do have that connection where they can ask me this, or they notice, oh, hey, she's slipping into a little bit of a situational depression, and they're there for me in that. And it's important to touch on the fact that that comes from allowing them to be there for me, you know, and actually starting those dialogues.
And giving them that permission to show you how much they care lets you know that you're not a burden as well. Like it's a collaborative effort to get that reassurance, you know, that you deserve help. Yeah,
completely. So switching gears just a little bit, you do have such a diverse community and diverse friend groups just from like our short time speaking. Have you noticed that maybe this mental health discussion or even depression looks different in maybe your male presenting friends versus your female presenting friends?
Definitely. I think conversations about how you're doing, like truly how you're doing, come more naturally to femmes and femme-presenting people, just because that space has been created in a way by the gender expectation that we are emotional beings versus like, but there's challenges to that too, because, you know, for a lot of women and femmes, it's like, oh, well, I have to prove myself as a serious person or like as an intellectual that doesn't get feelings. But that's another conversation. I think it is more of a problem for the male presenting people in my life. I mean, just my dad is a huge example, but also I definitely see that there are more roadblocks to expression when it comes to,
Yes.
male presenting people in my life and just how they experience their emotions and how they're able to talk about them. I do see, it's not a coincidence that they process differently, and that there are more kind of barriers to processing,
Yeah, for sure.
And it's also not a coincidence that, the femmes in my life reach for therapy much faster or much easier than the male presenting people in my life.
Yeah. Well, you know what? That's what we're here to change. We're going to equalize it all, baby. Yes. Well, this is a great wrapping point. So I think anything that's left that you want to say before we do our calls to action?
Yeah, that's what I was going to get into. So.
Yes. Okay, perfect. Yeah, we'll just head right into the calls of action. Do you want to go first? Do you want me to? Okay, yeah, of course. So my call to action for anyone who tuned in today, maybe you stumbled upon this, maybe it found you right when it needed to, check on those really soft, those really gracious people, the swans of our life. Check on them, let them know you're there for them. And also, don't be afraid to get a mental health screening. This is an amazing month to not only educate yourself on it, but push yourself a little. Hop into therapy, get a screening, see how you're doing, because it's okay if you're not doing okay. We are here for you.
Second that. My call to action is to allow yourself to play and make space for things that are healing for you. If that's art, focus on the process and don't worry about, the end result. Just allow yourself to do something because it's fun and because it's healing and because it's nourishing to your body, mind, or soul.
Yes, perfect. Now go out there and be more heartfelt. Woo!